spent an entire year prepping for this video to make this list. I dragged my friends to board game cafes whenever possible. I scoured tabletop simulator discords for anyone willing to teach a game release this year. I learned every single new release that dropped on Board Game Arena. And I spent way too much money on new games this year. I did all of this to get the biggest end of year tier list video that we've ever done on this channel at over, I think, 60 games. And I just want to say that I think this has been a pretty good year. And I certainly can't be alone in thinking that. And that's something that if you've been watching this channel for a bit, you know I very rarely, if ever, say. So let's get going and let me show you what I mean. So first up, we have Loot. In Loot, players control a horde of Vikings, raiding the mainland, capturing buildings, stealing the Englishman's cute little sheeps, and just racking up as much riches as possible while getting in your opponent's way at every turn till you are crowned the Jarl of the Vikings. Loot is a really clever little game, and true to its Viking core, you can be really mean in this game. I genuinely love looking at what my opponent needs and making sure I attempt to block them from ever getting it. To remedy that, the game does provide you a sort of one-time option to place your Vikings on the same tile as your opponent, but that ability to mess with your opponents is the only thing keeping this from being a completely solitary game. I think this game offers a pretty unique and fun puzzle with a ton of different options that are presented to you on every single turn you're playing. And yet despite that, it's relatively quick and fairly light. I give this game pretty much an enthusiastic A. You know, I play this game on Board Game Arena way too much. We just got the physical copy, so I'm pretty psyched to review it. Definitely check that out in the future. And next we have Maple Valley. In Maple Valley, you'll need to climb, swim, and dig your way to the most bountiful groves, forage for fresh spring ingredients to help villagers complete their errands, and unearth curiosities that will attract skillful scouts to your growing team. Welcome to yet another little anthropomorphic animal game. You know, I've reached this point where I feel like a curmudgeon with these types of games. You know, I'm beginning to hate their cute little smiles and the little animal hands. You know, give me anthropomorphic animal games that goes hard, you know, like the graphic novel Mouse, you know, with adult themes or something like Watership Down. I just want some bunny ultra-violence for a change. Let me know in the comment section if that game exists because I want to play it. But back to this family-friendly game. The game just kind of felt like it overstayed its welcome. We've played 3 games of this and each was taking a little over an hour, and it just didn't feel like the decision space in this game warranted that playtime. You know, my choices just felt obvious and a little scripted, and I never really felt engaged. I guess it's just not made for me, and that's fine. But this is my list, and I found this game to be pretty boring. So I'm going to put it between a C and a D. I'm just going to give it a D. It's a D. It's a D game. I get that it's a kid's game, but I know I've played kids games that I enjoyed, and this ain't it. You know, I always find the excuse, oh, hey, it's a kid's game, whatever, to be a little lazy. Next is Courtisans. In Courtisans, you receive and play 3 cards on each of your turns. 1 played at the Queen's table to sway a family influence. The 2 other cards are played in your domain and in your opponent's domain. The fun part is giving your opponents worthless garbage, but then also trying to avoid the inevitable backstabbing by the hands of all your friends. This is what family game night is made for. Trying to navigate at some moments small slivers of information while simultaneously sort of utilizing these hints gained through social deduction is a really enjoyable experience. Plus it helps a lot that there is a ton of screwage in this game, which, you know, if that is not your jam, you need to run away. You need to run away. This is not the game for you. Me personally, I love these types of games. My friends and I are always willing to jam a knife into one another's backs for a bit of fun between, you know, longer, heavier games. Although be careful, what's interesting about this game, at least in my experience, is that somehow the bad blood that occurred in this game seemed to carry over into other games. I think there is just something a little extra special to take that element here than the typical light card fare. And there's a good amount of extra bits too and mechanics here that I think elevate it beyond a very simple card game. You know, I appreciate the goal cards via the hidden objectives. I have a real soft spot for hidden objectives. You're going to notice that as time goes on, since they encourage people to pay attention, really close attention to other people's turns. I feel like this year was a pretty good year for lighter games. And while that's not typically my jam, I'm pretty happy with this one. And I think I would give this one an A. I think this one's an easy A. Next up is Dune War of Arrakis. Dune is an asymmetrical strategy game where players fight for control over planets, maneuvering all their little troops while sending spice harvesters deep into the desert to challenge the sandworms. The game features an action dice system with numerous event cards that enable you to tell a different Dune story every time you play. This game captures exactly what makes War of the Ring feel so good playing. You know, this game feels like you're in Dune's world. You know, it's a wonderful thematic experience that was a ton of fun to go through. If you're, if you're the Hakonin, you feel so powerful, but constantly worried because you're just surrounded by dirty freemen all the time. And if you're a freeman, you generally feel like these sort of like scrappy underdogs, engaging in guerrilla warfare. The combat system was relatively simple and quick and doesn't take away from the flow of the game. And the leaders and the elite units provide enough variety and fun without becoming too much of a burden through extra rules to remember. But a lot of games have come for War of the Rings crown, and I don't think this one lives up to the cake. It's a good game, and I think I'd give it a solid A. I think it's a tighter experience than War of the Ring, but it's not as epic and as sweeping as Lord of the Ring, which I kind of really love about the game. Next is Andromeda's Edge. In Andromeda's Edge, you'll be building a new civilization by gathering resources, claiming moons, acquiring modules to add to your station, and populating planets, all to gain supremacy in the galaxy. So this is another one of those sort of cheat entries. It just feels strange to put on the list because my love for Andromeda's Edge is entirely based on my love for Dwellings of Eldervale. And I don't want to say too much about this game because I want to do a separate review with Kim, because Kim really loves Dwellings, so I think she'll really like this. I've played this on Tabletop Simulator and I had a lot of fun. So I'm just going to say I think it does improve the combat system through the targeting mechanic, and the neutral factions just felt a lot more impactful and interesting than the monsters and Dwellings. But myself, I prefer a fantasy setting, but I do think this is the better game. I actually only played this game once or twice on Tabletop Simulator because I didn't want to I didn't want to spoil it too much, even though it's not a campaign game, if that makes any sense, because I knew I'd be playing the physical version eventually. So yeah, I give this one an S. Next is another light game, Botanicus. Botanicus sees players taking on the role of an aristocrat who is too lazy to take care of the garden himself. You'll force your gardener servant to water your plants, attract little helpful animals, play cards for bonuses, score lots of objectives, all to get as many victory points as possible and have the most beautiful botanical garden around. Make sure you do yourself a favor and skip right to the expert variant of this game. It allows you to receive powers when you gain animal tokens and makes movement a bit more complicated and a bit more interesting. It adds enough things where the game doesn't feel too shallow and unengaging because the base game is kind of boring. Botanicus, all in all, is a fun little puzzle that you're trying to solve that requires, peak efficiency in the actions you perform and where your gardener is on any given turn and what animals you've accumulated at the key moments you need them. It's rewarding without being punishing, but it's not so easy that it leaves you feeling that the game is lacking or that the game is too shallow. However, of course, the one drawback is that interaction here is borderline non-existent, which makes the game feel pretty laid back, which can be a good thing. Although you can pay fairly close attention to what other players are doing and use the neutral pawn that you get in a two-player game to cover spots that you know that they'll need. And that dickish behavior is always something that I kind of enjoy. And I will say that it kind of added to the game experience, at least for me. This game for me was an above average game that I did enjoy my time with on Board Game Arena. It plays a little long for what it is, but there was some interesting choices here. And I'm torn between, a B and a C. But what the hell? Like I said, this is the year of the light game, I suppose, so I'm going to be generous here and I'm going to give it a B. Next is a game that I thought, visually at least, looked super boring, Pampero. Pampero is a hand management, card-driven action selection game where players do their best to build a successful and efficient wind power system for Uruguay. This was a game where I shit you not, half of the table said something like, interesting, and okay then, when it was all over. It's a game that doesn't hide the fact that everything you're doing is for points. While some Euros may provide you various resources like wheat or apples that you trade for victory points, this entire game is just straight up do this for victory points and pay for this using victory points. There's no curtain, here obscuring the fact or some secondary resource sort of acting like a middleman, which some may find interesting, but it kind of felt boring. If that interests you, then you need to get this game. If it doesn't, then you need to avoid it at all costs. Also, in our household, it's very common for me to get ganged up on because I'm pretty decent at games. And so here, in our first 3-player game, nobody was using my bulldozers, and every time you use a person's bulldozer, you give them points, essentially. So I got blown out of the water because I was playing a game basically by myself while feeling like I'm third wheeling on a double date of a point salad. So in our second game, we go in and expecting a lot more negotiation, like, oh, I'll use your resources here if you use mine over here. But holy crap, that made the game take way too long. Pampero is not a game, this is not a game that will reward you with big flashy turns or interesting and unique powers that make you feel empowered. It's a very slow moving, contemplative experience one in which I didn't really enjoy. However, I'm happy that it exists because it is a very unique and interesting, and that means while I might dislike it, there are going to be people who really love it, and that's cool. But for me, this game is a pretty easy C. Next is Inventors of the South Tigris. In Inventions of the South Tigris, players do their best to get as many victory points as possible by inventing, building, testing, and publishing various devices by engaging in a fairly clever and creative dice placement system. There are a lot of moving parts in this game, and a lot of procedures to follow with every single turn, and it can be a little overwhelming when you first play, at least your first or second game. But that can be a good thing, and I've said this many times that I do really enjoy the process of being overwhelmed. The game also includes many ways that you'll be able to distinguish yourself from other players through various powers and bonuses, be they the research tile providing ongoing effects, or the workshop tiles that impact the power of the dice you place. I really appreciate the number of unique and interesting mechanics sort of all like working together, even if some can feel a little cumbersome and clunky at times, like sliding your tower out when you raise their levels. It's really weird. It's kind of weird. And the game can also feel a little procedural at times, which is really tough when you're the first starting out at the game. You're like, oh, okay, to perform this action here, I first have to do this, and then I have to do this, and then once I've done that, I do this. It feels strange. But all in all, it was a pretty decent game. Their games are always pretty good, so I give it a B. Next up is Spectral. In Spectral, players control treasure hunters, moving around the haunted manor to deduce and uncover treasure using secretly revealed clues, while also doing their best to avoid demonic curses. But uncovering that treasure is not enough. Treasure hunters need to make sure they have enough men in that area to take that treasure from other players once the game ends. This game is a really interesting spatial deduction puzzle because you're not only trying to figure out where things are, but also sort of positioning yourself in the best possible way to avoid getting hit by revealed curses and to dominate the most gem areas. I'm just really impressed with how he managed to incorporate area control into this game, because I do generally prefer when deduction games provide some semblance of a board game feeling and not simply make me feel like I'm solving Sudoku puzzles on the toilet. And the ability to place your explorer in this game really facilitates some very interesting mind games, which for me pushes this beyond something like Planet X, because I love that concept of purposely making it seem like I know where a gem is to other players, but in reality, I'm setting them up for a curse. This direction is an underutilized tactic in board gaming, I find. So I'm always very pleased when I can get that opportunity to be a clever dickhead. All in all, it's a generally well done deduction game, and so for that, if that's your jam, then this is going to be something that's an easy S, but for me, it's an A. And considering the fact that I'm not a big fan of deduction games, that's saying a lot. Next up is Tir Na Nog. In this game, you'll use your storyteller to encounter various events to build your saga, which essentially just means you'll place your worker to get cards to put them in your tableau. This isn't a thematic game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a damn good looking game. I thought this was going to be yet another sort of number color card placing game that was released this year, and there was a lot of them because I played a lot of them. But thankfully, there was something here that was a bit more than that. It's a fun little puzzle that balances your storyteller and your drafting cards with some pretty cool abilities. It's a game that rewards careful planning and an adaptable strategy. It's super easy to teach and enjoyable to play, and based on my limited time with the game, it felt very replayable. I look forward to playing this more, hopefully physically this year. I would probably give this a solid B. And next up is Inferno. Inferno sees players guiding souls through the circles of hell and trying to find them a lovely hellhome. But beyond being a hell tour guide, you'll also be sitting, burning infidels in the city, stealing, and doing whatever you can to get the most amount of infamy points before Dante reaches the gates to purgatory in this incredibly thematic Euro game. This is a very unique theme for a worker placement game that I was pretty excited to play, especially as someone with a fairly worthless English degree. Moving souls through hell, which mechanically is just going circle to circle to take actions, it's pretty damn cool. There's even a small element of programming here, which I always appreciate. I like when a game encourages me through its mechanics to think many turns ahead. And also, there's a lot of conflict in this game, and how the Guardians can also really mess with another person's day, or those fraud cards letting me steal people's shit. I always appreciate stuff like that, even though Kim most certainly doesn't. And there were moments when I felt I was moving up tracks sort of ad nauseum, but thankfully, that feeling, it didn't dominate the experience. All that to say, I enjoyed my experience with it. I didn't love it, but I would like to play this more in December at PAX, and I wanted Kim to see it too, because I think it might go up a little higher. But for now, it's For now, I think it's a solid B. It's a good game. Next up is Ezra and Nehemiah. In Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll be building the temple, rebuilding the city walls, teaching the Torah, and just generally moving up a collection of tracks until the end of the game, or you fall asleep. We, of course, have done a review of this game, so if you want to hear a more in-depth review of the game, definitely check that one out. But long story short, I enjoyed the game for a few months of owning it, but we eventually just ended up selling it because there really wasn't much there that had us craving it. We never said like, oh, let's play that game. It just never came up that way. The mechanic beyond playing those cards is enjoyable, as it can be a fairly tough decision that requires a lot of forward planning, which I do enjoy, but it wasn't enough to carry the game because the actions you actually perform are kind of dreadfully boring. This is a game where the whole Euro track moving criticism really comes into play. In most games of this type, the design does a good job at sort of obscuring the fact that you're just sort of moving up tracks. But here, that veil is lifted and you kind of see everything just naked, and it doesn't look good. And it really, if I'm being honest, I'm only putting this at the C tier because I enjoy that card mechanic, but otherwise I'd put it at D. Next up is Explorers of Navoria. In Explorers of Navoria, players explore the new continent by drafting cards, placing workers, gathering resources, and moving their cute little animal characters down tracks that are more or less the same, all in an effort to not fall asleep from boredom. This game left me feeling as if I was making almost no important decisions beyond, what symbols to draft. Every turn felt meaningless, and I felt impotent as a player. It felt like the designer was actively working against me to allow me to actually express any agency at all in this game. When building trade posts, it had to be, a specific order and on a specific spot. When gaining resources for contracts, they have to go on different cards, and you can't stack on the same card. When I place my workers down in the second portion of the game, I'm just matching colors and putting them on the space that I have to put them on because the other spaces are shit. Each color has 3 different spots you can place your token on, okay? And it's not a real choice because the value of the space descends. So the first spot is always the best spot. So, where's my player agency? Where's my interesting choices? If you want a more detailed analysis of this game, definitely check out the review. But for us, this game, it's an easy D. It's an easy D. Yeah, it was an unfortunate game. Next up is Tea Garden. Tea Garden is a strategy game set in ancient China in which you become a tea farmer, expand your plantations, grow the most valuable tea leaves, and become a master. The designer of this game released 3 games this year, and I think I've played them all, and I think this is the weakest one. The deck building portion of this game was pleasurable because when you get the card, it goes straight to your hand, which is always a lot more fun than just it going to a discard deck. And I'm certainly seeing why people recommend the game at 2 players, because we played at 3 and 1 at 4, and the game just felt like it overstayed its welcome, and the game just isn't providing enough depth to warrant that play time, in my opinion. And a lot of turns just sort of felt fairly obvious as to what I should do, and I didn't feel particularly challenged. And of course, there is almost no interaction aside from someone taking the card that maybe you wanted. Sometimes that's fine, but if you're going to make me keep my head down and worry about my own shit and ignore everyone else at the table, you better provide me a deeply satisfying puzzle to solve, because Tea Garden didn't provide that. I didn't hate it by any means, but this is I think it's an easy C. In my opinion, it was pretty damn mediocre. Next up is a game I've been playing way too much on Board Game Arena, Captain Flip. In Captain Flip, players take a tile from the bag and then decide if they want to play it or flip it to see what's on the other side. They place this bad boy onto their boat and then gain coins depending on the powers of the characters played. Finish 4 columns and the game ends, and whoever has the most coins is the winner. This is essentially a quick, super quick filler game. Like, obviously, not much interaction here beyond, the ever-raging cartography battle, where a player, you earn a gold coin for every turn that you are in possession of the map tile, and the cartographer gives you that map tile. And so you get this really irritating back and forth with each player is drawing one of those tiles. But I was quite surprised that this game did manage to build up some element of tension and suspense despite its game length. Like when you have 2 gunner tiles and you're agonizing over whether you should flip the next one, because if you get 3 gunner tiles by the end of the game, you just instantly lose the game. It's a really interesting push your luck game that I think is much better than what you would think from a game that plays in probably 5 minutes. But this game knows its function, and it's good at what it does, which is entertaining your guests when they showed up way too early on a game night, and now you're sort of left awkwardly sitting across from each other at the table, and you have to engage in conversation. Nobody wants to socialize at game night. That's disgusting. Just, you could play Captain Flip. I would say this game is sort of like one of those guilty pleasures. You know, it has the addiction appeal of those phone apps that you play and that you hit yourself after you're done. So I have to give it a B, but understand that I don't know if I'd recommend this game to everybody. Like I said, it's a guilty pleasure. And next up is everybody's game of the year, Arcs. Arcs is a sci-fi strategy game where players play cards to perform actions using a trick-taking mechanic, all to exert their dominance to the galaxy, gather resources, and engage in a little diplomatic intrigue. When I first heard that the game uses a simple trick-taking mechanic as its action phase, I definitely grimaced, you know, because I hate trick-taking games. And yet, it worked pretty well here. Like, in fact, this is the best, I don't know if I want to say it, the best trick-taking game I've ever played, even though I know it's only like a small little portion of it. The game just manages to constantly sort of ooze tension, you know, like with players feeling like every single action and turn is make or break. And it's so incredibly stressful and yet deeply satisfying, you know, because you're walking away with every single turn thinking to yourself, if I mess this up, I've lost the game. And it's a cool feeling. It's stressful, but it's cool. This game would have been enjoyable even without the individual player powers or the abilities of the core cards. And yet the addition of both of these things, it just makes it more fun. You know, it's a game that really does feel like it's designed for my friends and I, because we love meaningful aggression, which this game provides beautifully. And I can't tell you enough how beautifully satisfying it is to scoop up an objective at the end of a round by stealing resources from your opponent after a hard-fought battle. The game just rewards this sort of devilishly sneaky plays, and it's these interesting decisions that you have to make pretty much every single turn that just makes the game very engaging. There are so many neat little mechanics in this game, like capturing opponents' ships or imprisoning their men, or deciding if I should steal their resources or steal their cards to get even more opportunities in the future. And the way things are scored with players sort of choosing to forgo the number on their card and instead making it a 0 and choosing the objective that it will score at the end of the round. I love variable player controlled scoring like that. It just adds another cool tactical element. You know, it feels more empowering and feels like I have more agency in the game. But the cool thing is that it's not a game for everyone. You know, lots of people hate this game, but those are the types of games that I praise and seek out, because I don't want, you know, generic Euro number 231. I don't want yet another boring, mass-pleasing family game. I want something that's divisive, because it means that the designers swung for the fences and tried something new. And while I don't think I'm going to give this game the game of the year, I do give it the most creative game of the year award. Yeah, that's an award, the Turtle Creativity Award. Definite S game. Next up is Dead Cells. Dead Cells, the roguelike board game, is a dungeon crawler that offers a cooperative roguelike experience where players explore the ever-changing island of Dead Cells in this ruthless dungeon crawler. Get ready to explore, kill, die many, many times, and then do the whole damn thing over again. I'm a huge fan of roguelike video games. You know, games like Hades, The Binding of Isaac, Faster Than Light, or one of my favorites, the one in which I can't recommend enough, Fear and Hunger. There is just something about the difficulty and punishing nature of these games that just feels exciting. And I think this game does a decent job of capturing that sort of like, okay, let's try again essence of a roguelike game. And that feeling is certainly helped through the game's campaign system. Although I only played a handful of times, I enjoyed the permanent effects on the party you'd get for each new run, and how the game physically handled that by putting the mutation cards into its plastic sleeves on the game board. It felt like we were saving a game, which was neat. And of course, I also like the constant unlocks. You know, I think that's a big part of video games, that sort of gamification, this consistent feeling of progression and getting rewards. And I think the game captures that. But there were elements of this game that just felt a little clunky. And the game felt super lucky sometimes, and not necessarily in a good way. All in all, I think it was a C game. And next up is Rock Hard 1977. In Rock Hard, you'll play as an aspiring musician trying to carve their way into the industry by making mixtapes, writing songs, honing their skills, performing at venues, and consuming way too much candy. This is a worker placement game that is just dripping with theme. You really do get a lot of laughs after your first play, which I found just sort of faded away over time. And I noticed that as people started reading those cards, they just giggled a lot less, and they didn't really care what it was on the card. They just cared like, oh, what abilities am I getting? Those? Okay, great. They tossed it. So it was one of those games where the theme just sort of fell away after some time. And when that theme did fall, what was left was a fairly shallow worker placement game that didn't offer anything new beyond the fairly cool candy mechanic, which allowed you to take an action twice at a risk, sort of like a push your luck element. But aside from that, it was nothing you have not seen many, many times before. We did a review of this and we'll be posting it on our channel soon. So if you want more information as to whether or not we liked it and what our grade was of the game, give that a shot. But for now, this game is a C to me. It was pretty mediocre. Next up is Inventions, Evolution of Ideas. In Inventions, players put together mankind's greatest technological developments to get the most victory points possible, and at some point you just get bored and you stop playing. I think this is the weakest of all of his bigger games, and I think we've played all of them at this point. We are huge Lacerda fans. I believe we gave him an S tier in our designer ranking video that we did fairly recently, and I think that ranking was pretty well deserved. So this one was kind of disappointing. Each game I played it on Tabletopia felt exactly like the last game I played. It didn't feel like it had enough variability to keep me invested. And this game, more than any of his other games, just felt super procedural. Like every action felt like I was just going through a process that wasn't particularly enjoyable. And it just didn't feel like any of his other games, like it just felt very abstract and boring. And overall, just not particularly well engaging. I also did a tutorial on this game a few months ago, so if you're looking for a bit more info as to how the game plays, you can check that video out. So all in all, I give this one a D. I was just really disappointed. I guess if it was any other designer, I might give it a C, but because it's Lacerda, I'm gonna give it a D. You could do better, son. You could do better. Next up is Fromage. Fromage is an interesting simultaneous worker placement game where you'll place your workers on this sort of wheel of cheese and then rotate it. If after the rotation your worker is facing you, you take him off and perform the action. This is such a wonderfully clever design that enabled players to all play at the same time in a worker placement game, since you can only play in your sort of quadrant that's closest to you, which rotates at the end of every turn. And that simultaneous play is absolutely essential because there is a good amount of forward planning you need to do every turn, and it's nice that everyone is sort of performing that mental task at the same time. It's a tough decision because if you don't plan properly, you might have a turn where you have nothing to do or a turn where you have too many workers, since you can usually just place 2. The actions themselves are relatively simple and nothing you haven't seen before in any other worker placement game to date. You get resources and exchange them for points. It uses a small variety of different ways to get those points through area control, pairings and sets. But if the idea of simultaneous actions in a worker placement game and that sort of spinning wheel doesn't excite you or interest you, I wouldn't bother with this game. I think I gave this game a C. I gave this game a B. It's good for what it is, and like I said, it doesn't overstay its welcome. Next up is Leviathan Wilds. In Leviathan Wilds, players team up to take down giant colossuses by scaling up their bodies, falling to the ground countless times, stabbing crystals for some reason, and sharing lots and lots of mushrooms. This game was nice and quick, which for us is exactly what we want in cooperative games because we're not big co-op gamers in this household. And the concept of this one was just kind of cool. The game sort of reminds me of Shadow of Colossus, which I played tons and tons of times on the PS2, except with a lot more edible mushrooms growing out of the giants, which, that's a huge bonus. The game also has a good amount of variety too. Like I'm especially a big fan of the binder maps, like Jaws of the Lion. I think it's a good way to organize things. I do wish there was a few more ways to interact with friends because to me that's a big part of cooperative gaming, but there are mechanics here that are interactive, such as the player powers, and I love throwing the mushrooms at people and playing cards on another player's turn. Actually, you know what? I was gonna give it a B, but I think this is a pretty solid game, and my friends and I did have a lot of fun with it for what it was, which was a somewhat light cooperative game. Yeah, it was a good experience. I'll give it an A. Next up is Castle Combo. In Castle Combo, players draft cards to build a 3x3 tableau to trigger instant effects and endgame bonuses, all to get the most victory points by the end of the game. Considering the ease of the game, and there is a good amount here to keep me invested on every turn, and more importantly, aware of what my opponents are doing, because there's a good amount of interacting with other players at the table, which I find fairly rare in these sort of like relatively simple light card games. Also a really good variety of scoring methods, which again, for a simple card game, it's pretty damn impressive. Like I love how each card has its own ability that you have to be like super aware of, while also keeping in mind that its scoring objective and its placement, and its shield type, and its cost. There is a lot to follow that makes this game really engaging and interesting, that way more than it has like any right to be at such a short playtime and lighter game experience. There's also many ways that you can mitigate bad luck here because you only draw from either the top or the bottom row of cards. And you can use the key, what the game calls keys, to change where the messenger is, that is where you can draw from, to move them up to the top or to the bottom. And it sort of allows for a lot of like interesting interaction where if you're playing with 2 players, you can sort of make it so that like you can push him up at a place where you know your opponent doesn't want him so that he'll have to use a key. And in this game, keys can equal victory points. It's a neat little interaction that I really appreciate. I feel crazy doing this. I'm giving it an S. I'm giving it an S. I'm not a huge light gamer, but this one I really, really enjoyed. Like in terms of lighter card games, this is one of the best. It's one of the best. So yeah, I give it an S. Next up is Mycelia. Mycelia is a dynamic game of tactics and a competition for space and resources to create your own mushroom kingdom. The game follows a life cycle of fungi, a journey of creation, expansion, death, and rebirth. This is a heavily abstracted game that can see players expanding their mushroom network on the board by sort of rolling dice or playing unique mushroom cards. I love the potential new abilities brought about by decaying your mushrooms, which mechanically just means sliding them under your player board. Plus, it's a mechanic that excels the game forward because once 4 are played, the game ends. You very rarely see the obtainment of player powers being a controlling factor in game length, and it's an interesting touch. It's a creative touch. Other than that, though, it is a blend of various mechanics you've seen in other games, but you know what? That's okay. It was enjoyable to play, and the whole experience felt very slick and engaging and highly competitive despite its lack of direct player interaction. It's not a game that I absolutely love, but I'm happy to play my friend's copy, and I think because of that, yeah, I had a good time with it. I'm going to give it a B. Next up is Daitoshi. Daitoshi is a worker placement game where players work to make the city inhabitable by electrifying its districts, discovering new inventions, and trading with faraway cities. But you have to be careful because if you encroach too far into the wilds, you'll anger the spirits of the land. This game, all in all, felt pretty damn clunky. It was like there was just too many mechanics and procedures to follow on every single turn. There were a few times when I was just completely lost as to what I was doing during my turn because I just got interrupted like mid-turn because you were just like doing all these things like comboing here and then you do this and then you do this and then if somebody interrupts like, hey, can you go get me a drink? You're lost. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, there are going to be a lot of gamers who I think will really enjoy this. However, I found a lot of the actions, while very rewarding, do not really excite me. You know, the game gives you a lot to do every turn, but nothing feels particularly impactful. However, I do love that the game has this sort of pseudo-cooperative nature about it because you sort of build the board together as the game progresses. And so it's sort of this like cool interaction you don't typically see in a lot of worker placement games. We've also reviewed this game, so watch the full version to see Kim and I's thoughts. But for now, I have this game sitting at a C. It's probably closer to a B than a D, but that's still kind of a C. It did get better with more play. Oh, okay, you know what? I'm gonna give this game a B. It did get better. It's a low B, but it did get better the more and more I played. Next up, Flock Together. Flock Together is a charming cooperative experience that sees players taking on the role of battling chickens with asymmetric abilities working together to kick the shit out of invading predators and protect their eggs and lives so they can eventually be turned into chicken parmesan. First, let me just say I love the theme of this game. You know, I don't give a damn about chickens, but man, when my buddy was teaching the game to me, I was pretty enthralled. Like, being a battling chicken is not something I wanted to be as a child, but as I've gotten older, I now understand how important it is to explore my inner poultry. And I love the character booklets for tracking my abilities of my chicken and his level. It's very clever, it's very cool. And defeating the enemies, who also have their own little book, provides you a major piece of their equipment. Because it kind of feels like a video game where you defeat the big baddie and you get that cool weapon that he was using throughout the battle. There was a huge element of randomness that didn't feel enjoyable, like obtaining eggs or just the battle sometimes. It was just this game that after, I think, 2 plays, despite my friend loving it, to me it felt a little repetitive. And when he suggested it for, I think it was a 4th time, I left his house and I just never returned. We're not friends anymore. Like what my character could do with his abilities felt interesting, but I still felt like I was doing the same thing with those characters just over and over and over again, regardless of what abilities I was using. All in all, it was an okay game. I think this is a perfect candidate for a C tier. It's a C game. Next up is the 2-player game Ironwood. Ironwood is a fun, fast-paced area control game that sees one player playing as the woodfolk, prancing around the trees and stealing resources, and the other player playing as the role of the Iron Lads, destroying everything and just lumbering around the board. The nature of the game is area control with a lot of really cool actions that came from a fairly sizable deck that you'll certainly learn the more often you play. This is one of those games that I think if you give it enough time, it'll become much more competitive and much more interesting to you. And what's interesting is that it's from Mind Clash Games, and I usually expect something like really long and tons of depth and that feeling of being overwhelmed, which I didn't really get from this game, but I did get, for its limited short playtime, a good amount of depth. It was a pretty rewarding experience for a 2-player game. And I love how the theme of the game comes into play, even how these like different sides move. Like the wood people are naturally fast and they're sort of quick to respond, while the iron faction is more sort of lumbering and slow, with it feeling more like you're trying to push around this giant force of unwieldy pieces. And I'm always a sucker for that Princess Mononoke, you know, nature versus industry vibe. All in all, I give this game a solid A, a well-deserved A. It's a pretty damn good 2-player game if you like a sort of lighter war game. Next up is Undaunted 2200 Callisto. In the newest Undaunted, you'll navigate this barren lunar landscape, maneuver to seize dominant high ground positions, and utilize your formidable mechs to gain control of Callisto and its precious resources. You know, this game is Undaunted. You know the deal. Every new edition of this game just hits and feels unique enough to warrant owning, even if you own the previous versions. And I love the incorporation of elevation in this game, which is something a lot of miniature games don't even do properly. So it was nice to see a board game sort of incorporated in a way that was sort of interesting and engaging. Even though at its core, it's just getting to roll a higher numbered dice. It just works very well, and without feeling sort of cumbersome. I wish Kim enjoyed this game because I literally have nobody to play this with, so I'm just messing around with people on Tabletop Simulator. So if you see me on there, definitely hit me up. I would love to play with you. I have nobody else to play with. Woe is me. I would give this game a solid A, even though I can't own it. That sucks, but it is what it is. Up next, we have Fractured Sky. Fractured Sky is a game about deduction, sneaky strategy, and resource management, where players lead their kingdom in the hunt for the shards of fractured falling stars. I'm a huge sucker for these sort of hidden objective games because I find it really enjoyable to pay like hyper attention to what other people are doing, just so I can, you know, see if I can determine what it is that they know about the objectives of the game. It's a good way to force people to engage with one another in a new and interesting way. The area control here is enjoyable because you're not dealing with perfect information, which for me makes things a bit more tense and interesting. You know, you're holding your breath on the flip, just wishing that you played the right number and then you did everything properly on your turn. And I love the almost tonal shift that occurs where players are trying to formulate some sort of semblance of a resource engine in the first couple of rounds, and then all of a sudden it's just this like fortresses and skirmishes. At least that's what happened in the games that I played. I really appreciated that. It was a lot of fun. All in all, it was a pretty fun experience. I didn't love it, but I think this is a solid B. It's a solid B game. Definitely check it out. Next up is Sand. Sand is a quick pick up and deliver game that sees players traveling around the desert, visiting different towns and collecting goods and doing the usual pick up and deliver stuff that you've seen probably a million times before. We of course did a review on this game, so if you want a more detailed analysis, you can see that video. To me, Sand is sort of what the C tier was made for. It's the perfect example of sort of absolute mediocrity. It excels at being completely average and having nothing about it that'll make you love it or particularly hate it. It's a game that came and had a little bit of hype, and now absolutely nobody talks about it. So yeah, like as I said, this is a C game. Not by any stretch of the imagination a bad game, just not one that you're going to remember a year from now. Next is Primal The Awakening. Primal is a fully cooperative deck crafting boss battler board game featuring card-driven tactical combat and large-scale miniatures. I admit I approach this one with a huge chip on my shoulder because I have yet to be inspired by a boss battler. It's this genre that feels like it has so much potential to make a brilliant game that sort of emulates a tabletop war game, sort of distilled into a board game. Yet in my opinion, almost every game fails miserably at accomplishing this and usually just feels like a poor derivative of some decade-old shit minigame with uninspired mechanics but loads and loads of plastic minis. This game, however, had relatively good card play and some satisfying combos, and the classes are certainly unique enough to provide some needed variety between plays, and the progression you feel playing your character, it was also pretty rewarding. It was pretty good. I also really like how monsters react as you're taking your turn. It's a nice touch and it's wonderfully thematic. However, these reactions, of course, come at a cost. Now the difficulty comes from having to remember a slew of bullshit every turn. You need to be on the ball for all of your own crap. Remember how the monster reacts, remember perils, objective cards, various keywords here and there, and some other junk that it annoyed me. It sort of annoyed me the same way Sentinels of the Multiverse annoyed me. I was really psyched for that game, and then all the stuff that you have to keep up on, all the bookkeeping just made me hate it after a while. But despite that, it still left me fairly entertained. It's not a great game by any stretch of the imagination, but I think for a dungeon crawl, it's pretty good. So I'm gonna give it a C. But this is coming from somebody who doesn't like these sort of boss battler games. And I do think, even though I'm giving it a C, it's probably one of the better ones I've played, so take that as you will. Next is a game that was popular for all but a month, Windmill Valley. In Windmill Valley, you take on the role of tulip farmers competing to build windmills, find new tulips for your farms, hiring help to gain an advantage on the competition, and spinning cogs over and over again until the game ends and your final cog form is far superior to everyone else's cog. This game has a lot of wonderful, clever mechanisms, all sort of working together very nicely to provide a really engaging and rewarding game, where each action you perform, provided you have the right upgrades, feels like you are sort of comboing in a really satisfying way. I'm also a huge fan of the gears in this game. It reminds me of Praga to some extent, which also, your actions are dictated by these gears. But here, your gears are fully customizable and they're your own, which makes every single game that you play sort of different from the other ones. And more importantly, it makes you feel empowered, which is something that, sort of endears me to games almost instantly. I want the game to make me feel like I'm doing something, I want something amazing every single turn. And I think this game provides it. Whether it's the unique contracts I make with specialists who will give me special abilities, my own personal action gear configuration, or hell, most of the mechanisms of this game provide that feeling, and I really enjoy it for it. The best Hero games for me are not only the ones that attempt something new with their mechanisms, but also make each action feel impactful and important, and not simply like I'm moving up a track. I would have liked to see some form of meaningful way to engage with people at the table. But even as it stands right now, I still really enjoyed this game. So I'm going to give Windmill Valley an A. I think it's an A game. I really liked it. Next up is a game I played to death on Board Game Arena, River of Gold. In River of Gold, players use their boat to travel down the river, performing various actions such as developing new ports, markets, and various other buildings, as well as doing their best to grow their wealth and visit nobility, all in an effort to get as many points as possible. This game, surprisingly, has a good amount of player interaction in how you're able to use other people's buildings. It sort of reminds me of Callisto in movement and in shared building use. Although this is obviously a much nicer version because Callisto is just wonderfully savage. And there's just a good amount of varying mechanisms here that all sort of work together to create a fairly relaxed and enjoyable experience that isn't too simple, nor is it too convoluted that it's sort of jarring and overwhelming. It's a very streamlined and laid-back game. The area control here is pleasurable instead of tedious, and you're still rewarded for moving up these influence tracks regardless of whether or not you're in the lead by the end of the game. It was a good vibe, It still provided, and yet, despite that, it still provided a pretty good competitive experience. I think, for me, this game is a pretty easy A. I really liked it, and I'm looking forward to getting the physical copy of this, because I think Kim will like it too. Next up is yet another boring card game, Pixies. In Pixies, players pick a card from the display and place them according to their number. Cards placed on top of one another earn their value in points, and you'll score extra points for the largest color zone in your play area. That's it. That's the game. Pixies, in my opinion, was dreadfully boring. It's very light, which is fine. This is, like I said, this is the year of the light game, but I feel like it runs a little longer than it should, which sounds strange because it's already a pretty short game. I think it's that sort of 3-round format that totals all of your scores that I found really irritating. And with that in mind, never play this with more than 2. There are lots of games out there that advertise more than 2 players, but it's a purely marketing thing because they fear, 2-player games won't sell as well. You're gaining nothing, absolutely nothing from adding more than 1 player to this game, or more than 2 players to this game. There is some push your luck here and there, since one of my strategies is to validate a card by flipping it over onto an empty spot in the high value areas in the hopes that you sort of get a good card down the road. But even that, it feels relatively brainless. It never really felt like I was making any important decisions. Every action, which consists entirely of just taking cards from the offering feels, like I said, it feels pretty obvious. It isn't tough to do a quick calculation of the optimal move in most cases. At least that's how I felt. The hate draft in this is, of course, strong, and I give it props for that, because I do enjoy that from time to time, but there's just not enough here that, in my opinion, would give this game anything more than a D. I don't despise it. I didn't hate many of the games on this list, but I definitely didn't like it. So yeah, it's an easy D. Next up is yet another collectible card game, Star Wars Unlimited. In Star Wars Unlimited, players will be battling one another with cards using the iconic heroes, villains, ships, and settings from the Star Wars universe in a quick and engaging collectible card game. Listen, I don't give a damn about Star Wars, but I did have some fun with this one, both in person at a buddy's house and at a bunch of times at some site called, I think it was Felt Table. I love the alternating battlefields. I've seen this in some other card games before, but even so, it's fairly refreshing and adds a good dimension and depth to what is otherwise a straightforward deck battling card game. You know, like the triggers, the events, and powers they're nothing you have not seen before for the most part, but they all do come together nicely for a fairly easy to follow and fun play experience. You know, this game's not reinventing the wheel, but there's enough there that I think you're going to be entertained. Like I said, there's lots of fairly cool and interesting decisions here, but this is a really heavily saturated space that I really only dabble in from time to time. I do enjoy this one, so I'm going to give it a B. It's not my favorite collectible card game. That will always be Game of Thrones, but this is a pretty good one. It's a pretty good one, and if you love Star Wars, you should probably give it a shot. Next up is the only game on this list that I genuinely hated. Again, Harvest. In Harvest, you'll be taking on the role of a farmer, drafting sunrise cards for bonuses, gathering resources, planting seeds, and tilling your land, all to get as many victory points as possible in one of the most basic games imaginable. Now, if you're not familiar, this is a re-release with some updates to his previous Harvest game, and honestly, it still feels dated as hell. I genuinely wanted to love this game because it's made by the same guy who made one of my favorite games of all time, Argent, which is a brilliant game. It's messy, but it's absolutely brilliant. But damn was this game boring. It was so boring. It was just... It was not just boring, though. It was like really basic. It offers nothing interesting, engaging, or innovative. It's just this like simple tile placement game and worker placement game that feels like it feels like someone's first board game design ever. And not just that, but like a designer who's playing it completely safe and offering you like nothing of value. You know, two of the actions, tend and plant, are the same exact action, except one uses water instead of your poop resource to perform, and one can be taken from the supply instead of from your seed. Doesn't that sound so interesting? And there are other actions in this game that just feel identical. The whole damn thing just feels so fucking lazy. You know, the game's only saving grace are I guess the variety of buildings, but honestly, they're all enabling you to do more of the same basic boring actions or providing you end game points. Seriously, like why not include some buildings that provide a player some special powers, like to really engage them? And why even bother with the tile placement mechanic if you're not going to do anything interesting with it? Seriously, you would think there'd be some form of pattern matching, you'd be doing or maybe connecting similar types for bonuses, points, or something. I don't know anything beyond just taking a tile and just placing it wherever it bloody well fits. The game is so damn uninspired that if you haven't guessed it by now, it kind of irritates me. And this game is just, it's an easy D. Actually, you know what? The other games in the D list are better than this game. And to put this game in the same list as those games feels insulting to those games. So I'm giving it a special place in, I don't know, the Tabletop Turtle Stinker of the Year award. Especially the F tier makes an appearance just for this one game. Next up was my favorite abstract strategy game this year, Harmonies. Harmonies is an abstract strategy game that sees players drafting a set of 3 discs at the start of their turn, which they'll use to place on their board to complete various patterns required by animal cards they've drafted. Whatever you do, do not let the cute, colorful animals fool you, okay? This is a seriously difficult game, and I can't stress that fact enough. It's super easy to learn and easy to understand, but once you start playing, you're engaging in one hell of a mentally taxing puzzle. Now, I won't get into too much detail here. You can see Kim and I's full review of this for a better breakdown, but in general, we did enjoy this game. To me, this is one of those easy A games. But like I said, check out the review for more details. Yeah, I really liked it. And next is Rebirth. In Rebirth, players rebuild a society after disaster, place various tiles on their board to score points and achieve various goals, and compete to take possession of the various castles in the country. This is by far one of the easiest games to teach that I played this year because your actions on any given turn they're pretty simple because you're just taking a tile and placing it. And yet despite that, there's enough here to sink your sort of your tactical teeth into as an enjoyable playing experience despite its relative simplicity. There is some luck here because you're often not going to draw the tiles you really want, but sometimes that limitation provides a lot of opportunities to sort of adapt and get creative. And it's a really hard rope to walk, I know, for a lot of games, but Knizia is usually the best at it, and this game is no different. There's like a lot of games, this is something you haven't seen before. I'm going to give it a B, but I'd really like to play it with Kim because she's a huge Rainer Knizia fan. Next up is Unconscious Mind. In Unconscious Mind, players formulate new therapeutic techniques to treat patients, establish their practice, share insights with peers, publish theories, and do their best to become Freud's most distinguished contemporary. I don't typically make a lot of comments on art and components because I don't see a purpose, since you can just you could see that shit for yourself. But the art here it's really spectacular, and the theme's a pretty fun one. I love all the variable player powers you accumulate throughout the game to really sort of empower you and make you feel different from every other player at the table. It's a cool feeling. On any given turn, you really are doing your best to maximize efficiency, and the turns you take, they never feel obvious or scripted, which is a nice feeling, because in a lot of these heavier Euros, sometimes that's not the case. Sadly though, interaction here was pretty damn low aside from taking people's spots, but I suppose that's just par for the course these days when it comes to worker placement games. Just be aware of that if you're considering this game. Aside from that, the other criticism I would have is that there's a lot going on and a lot of different boards. Like, there's a lot of shit in this game. You're moving up and down, and it can be a little overwhelming. It's a game that I had to play a few times to really like wrap my head around it. It's a pretty deep game, and it's a relatively complex game. I don't know if it's one that's going to last forever, but so far I'm enjoying my time with it, and this is another one of those games I really want to show Kim, because I do really think Kim will like it. So I'm giving it a B. It's a B game. Next up is Cities. Cities is a tile laying game where on your turn you'll place your worker in one of the 4 rows to gain new structures to place in your city and new ways to score points for the end of the game. Cities is a cute little tile laying game that plays relatively quickly and features the odd challenge, here and there, but it's still a relatively shallow experience that I didn't really love as much as I thought I would. If you want to see a more detailed analysis of this game, definitely check out our review. A lot of turns, they just felt obvious. I couldn't really set up for a long-term strategy, naturally, given how the game state changes so often, but also I didn't feel like I had a lot of ability to really pivot and exercise good tactical plays. Not having to care that much, how I place my tiles felt a little strange. I think it's a beautiful way to get your players to think a little bit more by constraining them in some way, but letting them just sort of plop those tiles down wherever they willy-nilly want just didn't feel particularly challenging. Yeah, I won't go into too much more about this game. It's a C game. It's a C game. It's pretty mediocre. Next up is A Message from the Stars. A Message from the Stars sees an alien and scientist doing their best to communicate with one another by deciphering what the other one is trying to say. This is yet another word party game that the hobby space has a ton of that fight viciously in my collection for a spot, because honestly, I can only handle 1, maybe 2 of these types of games in my collection at a time. Now, this game in particular does offer more depth than the traditional party game, because you don't only have to guess the words of the other side, but also the letters on the same card as the word. This puts the game in a really strange spot, because it's a bit much for the average guest. I would typically teach code names or decrypto to, but too little to really keep my friends and I entertained, because most of my friends are not particularly big fans of word games, and I'm not either. The whole experience on the whole on my table left everyone feeling a little clever after they were able to get, everything right. And it's always nice when games facilitate both that feeling and that sort of engagement. Everybody wants to feel smart, I guess. And for that, I give it a B. It's a good game. Next up is a remake of a classic game, Cyclades Legendary Edition. Cyclades is a classic dudes on a map game that everyone loves at this point, but now it's legendary because it's on Kickstarter or something. Quick, stop watching this video right now and go get it. Oh, wait, you can't. The campaign is over. I am the worst Kickstarter shill ever. It's Cyclades. It's great. This is just like some sort of director's cut version of the game with a few things refined, and the overall experience did feel more fun than the original game. Hell, just adding the modular board made it infinitely better, and the bidding here is much better and much quicker. And if you don't like that, you can still play in classic mode if you don't appreciate the new changes. We actually made a tutorial of this edition, which was published ages ago. So if you want to learn how to play or what the differences are, go check that video out, because I spell it out in more detail. I'm putting this in the A because Cyclades is a great game, and I think this improves it. Yeah, I really enjoy it. This is an A game. Next up is the talk of the town, at least this year, SETI. In SETI, you lead a scientific institution tasked with searching for traces of life beyond planet Earth. You'll explore nearby planets and their moons by launching probes from Earth, while taking advantage of ever-shifting planetary positions. Decide whether to land or to surface to collect valuable samples, or stay in orbit for a broader survey. Now, this is one of the only games on this list that I've only played one time. Like I said, I put a lot of work into this list playing these games over and over again, but unfortunately, my friend was only available to play it once. But we will be reviewing our own copy after we head to PAX Unplugged this December to pick it up. I'm curious if my rating here will change after we play it probably a dozen or so times before we do a proper long-form review, but we'll see. The game took a few turns to really understand, but once it got going, it was a lot easier and more accessible than I initially thought. And of course, I really love the multi-use card play that was somewhat akin to Terraforming Mars. You know, like every part of that card in SETI mattered. And it was always a tough choice deciding what to do with every single card that ended up in my hand. You know, which that decision space, it's enjoyable. As stressful as it is, it's enjoyable. I'm totally digging it. I think I understand why this game is getting a lot of hype. I really appreciate it. It's an A. It's an A game. Next up is MLEM Space Agency. This game sees players selecting cute astronaut kittens with special powers to shoot them into space to land among the stars and planets, or just blow up in a fiery wreck because the pilot pushed his luck just a little too hard. Goodbye, kitties. This is a fairly light and relatively low-stakes push-your-luck game that sadly doesn't have that same level of excitement you would normally get from a push-your-luck game. At least, that's what I experienced. However, it is a delightfully cute game, and there is a good amount of interaction with your fellow players here and there. Like one cat's ability to remove a die once they leave the ship. I always felt like sort of devilishly clever putting that cat on the rocket where the other two players put their high point cats, primarily because I'm an asshole. This is one of those games I can see resonating with families really well. Sadly, I don't think my playgroup would get much out of this game beyond a couple of enjoyable plays. You know, after about 4 or 5 plays of this, I somewhat lost interest in playing again because there really just isn't enough depth here to keep me interested. But like I said, if this is a good family game, I'm gonna give it a C. But you know, if this sounds appealing to you, if you want a sort of lighter push your luck game, you should check this out. Next is Wyrmspan with some dragons or something. Wyrmspan. In Wyrmspan, players build a sanctuary for dragons, taking their turn, excavating caves, generating resources, laying eggs, and pretending they're not just playing Wingspan with extra steps. I do appreciate this game is more than a reskin. You know, I certainly don't want a Monopoly-like affair, where games sort of capitalize on previous iterations' successes by just sort of strapping on some paint. You know, I like that it's more like a variation of Risk, you know, if you remember those, where it plays very differently, at least to some extent. Exploring the caverns certainly makes more thematic sense, but really it just sort of acts as an extra bit that I need to do to sort of like fiddle around with to get roughly the same experience I got when I played Wingspan in regards to sort of like activating those cards in a row and getting that, you know, endorphin hit every time all the things trigger. I also really don't like that this isn't designed by the same person. Like they had someone else come in and tweak the game to what I think is supposed to be a more gamer audience by adding in a few bits here and there, like the cavern tiles and exploration. But the extra bits, in my opinion, just kind of clutter a fairly well-designed and accessible game without adding anything in terms of depth and strategy. It sort of reminds me of all those like direct-to-video, you remember this? It was like direct-to-video movies that Disney would put out where it'd be like Aladdin Part 2 or something, and it wouldn't have Robin Williams in it, and it was just like this like kind of like poor carbon copy. That's what this game kind of felt like. But like I know a lot of people really prefer it more than the original. I think those people are crazy. I give this a C. It's pretty decent though, so you should check it out if you really love Wingspan and you've played it to death. Next up is another mediocre card game, Solstice. In Solstice, you select a card from the face-up cards that match either the color or number of one of your existing cards, and then place both in your tableau to connect to as many cards as possible and make groups of 4 to attract woodland creatures that provide you points. There, I just taught you the entire game in 5 seconds, and as fun as it was to listen to that explanation, it's as fun as it was to play this game. Like a lot of these types of letter games, the only interaction here is the competition over a scarcity of resources. Since there is only one number card of each color, so the game does demand that you pay attention to what your opponent is doing, which is the enjoyable part of the game. That kind of leads me to my next point. There's a ton of luck in this game that can sometimes leave you feeling like you're behind the 8 ball when you see your opponent, you know, being handed just perfect cards. Meanwhile, your cards are for areas on the opposite ends of the landscape. It can be really damn frustrating. And after a lot of plays, and I've played this a lot on BGA, it just left me bitter. Even after I won, it left me bitter. All in all, it's a cute little abstract, you know, card laying game. I think it's a C game. Next up is one of my favorite games this year, The Jest of Robin Hood. The Jest of Robin Hood is a coin game where the sheriff chases Robin Hood across Nottingham as Robin Hood organizes peasant revolts and attempts to steal supplies from the sheriff's caravan. This might be one of my first coin games. It's not that I've avoided them, it's just that there wasn't anything drawing me to them. But this one sounded really interesting, and I'm happy I gave it a shot because this one, it was a hell of a lot of fun. I really loved this game. And I love the art in this game. I'm happy that they didn't do some sort of weird anthropomorphic animal crap like Root, and instead used like old medieval art. I love how they just I don't know, at that time, they just didn't understand perspective and or they didn't know how to draw horses. Just brilliant art, brilliant. And mechanically speaking, this game, it's damn good. It's damn good. The sneaking mechanics are, they're wonderfully clever, and they add a great amount of depth without sort of bogging you down with rules. And the way the carriages work under the control of the sheriff is equally amazing. It just makes thematic and mechanical sense because it's easier to sneak with less characters as Robin Hood, and it creates a good amount of head games too, because the sheriff is doing his best to figure out where Robin Hood is going. In order for the sheriff to get gold, you have to send these carriages out after collecting taxes from the towns, and then make it back to Nottingham without Robin Hood sort of like robbing it. But the cool thing is you could set up these bluffs where you can make Robin Hood think it's, the undefended cart, but really guards are waiting inside it, just kind of ready to pounce. The card play is of course brilliant. It uses the shared deck with benefits both sides on the same card, and it's challenging and engaging to make that hard choice to go and enact the card's action, or to sort of do your own thing and do your own plots and deeds like recruiting or capturing. I think this is a game that everyone should try if you enjoy two-player games. It doesn't take that long. It's super engaging. It's super thematic. There's lots of really cool, unique, fun mechanisms. It's awesome. It's awesome. It's an easy yes. It's an easy yes. For me, I'm gonna give this game of the year. I've been playing it a lot in Board Game Arena. I really hope I can get a physical copy of this. I actually emailed GMT. I was like, please send me this. I'm going to give it a glowing review because I really love it, but they didn't contact me back. So I'm going to go and I'm just going to buy it. Next up is Gnome Hollow. Have you ever played a meeple on a road in Carcassonne to score big points and thought to yourself, shit, this needs to be the entirety of a game? Well, that's Gnome Hollow, except you can't steal other people's roads and you collect mushrooms for some reason. Gnome Hollow is a cute game with a very cute theme, and it's relaxing and fairly pleasant to play. It's not one that excited me, but I did enjoy my experience of finding the perfect tiles to create my pass. And while I found it fairly light and a little long for what it was, there is some strategy here. Like the fact that you have to move a gnome on your turn can actually be a little stressful because both gnomes might be standing on large, uncompleted paths. So you have to be careful whether your opponents will score that path when you leave. And speaking of opponents, there is very minimal interaction here since you're primarily just racing to fulfill set a number of mushroom sales before your opponent. So while you are paying close attention to what they're doing, you're not really that engaged with them. Which is unfortunate because the most fun part of Carcassonne is coming in and sort of stealing the road with two robbers, at least in my opinion. If you're in the market for a tile-laying game though, I think it's worth checking out. I give this game a solid C. Next up is Let's Go to Japan. In Let's Go to Japan, players have 6 days to cram as many activities as possible into every day they're in Japan by drafting activity cards in a fairly relaxed and non-confrontational puzzle to optimize your experience while balancing your resources. I really like how the game incorporates a little discovery and luck with the planning because you can take cards you don't want to use and flip it to do what the game considers like going for a walk and sort of just, impromptu exploring. It's a nice thematic touch, and it adds a nice surprise when you get to the running your schedule portion of the game when you get to find out where you went essentially. It's cool. Although thematically, something about this game and how you attempt to maximize your points by jamming as many likewise activities into a single day, it felt, thematically jarring and mechanically not particularly interesting. Like you could load up a single day with all your shopping events, which to me would just it'd be literal damn torture. My back can't handle that shit. You ever seen those images of like the shopping dads and they're all like standing a certain way to keep their back from getting sore? That's what this game reminded me of. It just felt like some boring scoring simulator, and I didn't hate it, but for me, it's nothing more than a D, I think. It's a D for me. Next up is Imperium Horizons. In Imperium, players draft cards to place into their tableau, which represents one of the many civilizations available in the game. They gain resources, destroy their opponent's cards, and develop their civilization to become the most dominant empire the world has ever seen. I like this one because I like Imperium. You know, the Inuit faction is really cool to play. It's probably the standout faction. They swap between Empire and Barbarian like it's summer and winter, and you can sort of feel the way they play drastically changes when the winter hits, and you're trying to make, you know, sort of every resource count. It's a beautiful thematic touch that's really clever. I really liked it. The inclusion of the trade network is a nice touch too, and breathes some fresh life into this game that over time I have grown a little lukewarm on. If Imperium started off at a sort of 9 for me, it's starting to feel more like a 7. And that's still good. You know, I'm not one of these people that inflate scores. 7 is still good, and it's worth keeping in my collection. I'm not going to get rid of it. But it has lost a lot of the excitement. And while I do think this improves on the whole experience quite a bit, I'm going to put this one at a B. I'm going to put this one at a B. I'm going to give it more plays. I'm going to hope it gets better in the future. But for now, it's a B. Next up is another card game, Arctic. In Arctic, I think you're going around spotting animals or something. I don't know. Just place your damn cards and get your damn victory points. Every animal has a unique player power in this game that you can obtain if it's the last card you play. And those powers can be taken from you if your opponent ever plays that same animal card. The powers themselves are varied and interesting enough to be engaging. Combine that with a fairly competent exercise in efficiency, which I believe is the real heart of this game, since you have to be very mindful of your current hand size, since if you have to discard cards, you'll lose points. And I really like that interesting cat and mouse game that occurs when trying to determine the opponent's animal totem. You know, do you move your piece to the right quickly and early to get a good lead, or will doing so sort of easily reveal it's your totem, and so instead maybe you should let it hang back till maybe like the end of the game? It's a nice little touch, and I appreciate stuff like that in these sort of lighter games. I'm pretty pleased with this one, and I'm still playing on Board Game Arena, so I'm gonna give it a B. It's a good game. It's a good game, and I want to play it physically at PAX. Next, we have Middle Ages. In Middle Ages, you are the head of a fiefdom in your future lands, developing new, prosperous buildings, assaulting neighboring fiefdoms, and just placing tiles until you forget there is a theme at all to become the most influential lord of the kingdom. This is a tile collection game that's pretty similar to King Domino, somewhat. You're offered a very limited selection, and if you choose the leftmost tile, you'll choose first the next turn. So on any given turn, you have basically 4 tiles to choose from, which doesn't give you a ton of room to strategize. You know, because at least in King Domino, you know, I'm determining where I want to place that tile once I've taken it, but here it just goes to a predefined slot. You do, however, have choices that extend beyond picking tiles. Like the church, for example, lets me beef up a tile so that they earn more income. And all these other tiles do have a special ability, which I did find pleasurable. It's mildly enjoyable in its simplicity, but it doesn't offer anything that's particularly interesting. I think it's a pretty good C game. It's just a good C candidate. And up next is Spectacular. In Spectacular, you try to create the best natural park in this wholesome, cozy family game to create a good space for lots of endangered animal species to do the nasty, and then watch them get it on in the watchtowers that you build. All the actions of this game are done simultaneously, which is nice here because it means minimal downtime, and the game doesn't overstay its welcome for what it is. However, there's not much interaction here. Everyone was just kind of doing their own thing, which can be good sometimes, but overall the game had some nice mechanisms where you're doing the typical tiling thing with the added element of placing the dice on those tiles to get the big points. It felt like every turn I was working on multiple things at once, despite the feeling that I was engaging in a fairly tight puzzle with somewhat limiting options. And all in all, for that, it was an enjoyable experience. I give it a B. It was a good game. Next up is Slay the Spire. In Slay the Spire, players team up to fight hordes of baddies as they ascend the spire, all while improving their cards, earning abilities and relics, and getting their asses kicked over and over again until they improve their chances of survival. This one was pretty damn cool. In the few times that we ended up playing, we did legitimately find ourselves, devising new strategies to tackle the same objective, which made the game feel fresh and engaging each play, unlike a lot of these sort of beat up the baddie type games. And despite getting stronger, I never felt overwhelmed by having to keep track of too much garbage on the table, which is always a bonus. I have to say that this is probably one of my favorite cooperative deck builders. It's certainly not an experience with as much depth that as I'm accustomed to, but for its genre, I think this is packing a punch. I give this one a pretty enthusiastic A, and this is coming from somebody who doesn't particularly like a lot of cooperative games. Next up is Galileo Gaililei. This game is a Euro-style game in which you take on the role of an astronomer who will be discovering new planets, find unknown star systems, develop their telescope, and make a scientific breakthrough in the difficult age of obstructionism. I love the action selection mechanism that is obviously somewhat inspired by Ark Nova, where the action you can perform gets sort of pushed down to the bottom, although in this game, the action doesn't become less impactful when it moves to that bottom. Here, it's more taking advantage of certain combinations of tiles. And I love that the game almost seems to encourage the bad stuff that happens throughout the game through the Inquisitors, since you want to attract some Inquisitors to your project to manipulate them sort of properly to get more efficiency out of your actions. So it's sort of like this, not a push, a little bit of like a push your luck thing, where you want some of the bad stuff to get some good stuff, but not too much bad stuff. It's pretty well done. And shout out to the anime we're currently watching called Orb, that has the exact same theme. It's like one of the best anime released this season, if you liked anime. Now this game is to your typical point salad Euro fare, which the market is obviously oversaturated with at this point. But you know, if that's the type you gravitate towards, I think you're going to enjoy this one. You know, I think it has a really solid theme that doesn't just disappear as you're playing. I think the mechanisms are pretty fun. I give this a solid B, and I'm hoping to play it a bit more in the future. Next up is Civolution. Civolution is a medium-heavy to heavy Euro-style game that utilizes a dice selection mechanism to trigger actions on a tech tree-like structure. I described the theme instead, but it's a Feld. I think you're aliens taking a civilization exam or something. I don't know. Who cares? Get points. Let's get this out of the way, okay? I'm not the biggest Feld fan. For me, this game, it kind of just felt like another Feld game, but just a lot longer and a lot bigger. Which if that excites you, then this game is a no-brainer for you. A lot of the stuff I did in this game just felt relatively meaningless, with a variety of like different colored tracks I was going up that I didn't really care about, and the main board where I'd fight over some space that I didn't really care about. I suppose none of this really matters though, because if you're playing a Feld game expecting theme, you're silly. No, here it's about being as efficient as possible and conquering any semblance of bad luck that comes your way through the dice you didn't want. The whole damn thing, it sort of just took too long and provided a puzzle that was one I didn't really give a shit about. All the actions just kind of, to me, felt a little samey. So I'm going to give this one a C, but I am curious to see if it gets better as I play it more in the future, because my friend owns a copy, so I don't know, hopefully it gets better. Next up is Duel for Middle-earth. In Duel for Middle-earth, you take on the role of either the Fellowship of the Ring or Sauron. As the Fellowship, you aim to prevent the enemy from gaining ground and work to destroy the One Ring. And as Sauron, you try to capture the One Ring and gain as much ground. This is of course a implementation of the modern classic Seven Wonders Duel. And honestly, if you like that game, I'd say you might be able to skip this one unless you really, really love it and you want something a little different. The board sort of represents different factions in Middle-earth, and you're trying to have military in each region because if you get one in each, you win. It was a pretty cool addition, and the One Ring is sort of this track where players get bonuses as you move along, and obviously the Fellowship wins if it reaches the end, or the Sauron wins if, you know, the Nazgul catch up. Honestly, I could see a person wanting to own both. It did feel unique enough to warrant that. However, if I had to pick only one, I might just pick this one, but that could be my love for the theme. I think the added elements, they did add a bit more fun to the game. So I'm gonna give this one an A. Me and Kim are enjoying it right now. Next up is the biggest release at PAX, the one everybody was talking about, everybody was whispering about, trying to rush until it's sold out, Hello Kitty's Day at the Park. In Hello Kitty Day at the Park, players take on the role of an annoyingly cute cartoon character to compete for the best day at the park, or some such nonsense, by collecting bullshit resources like flowers, all to complete uninteresting adventures. As you would probably expect, a very basic game involving, you know, moving your little character around the map. You build as the game progresses to simply collect resources on each spot that you pass through to fulfill individual contracts that you collect after you fulfill them. Very few areas for any semblance of strategic play, although I suppose given the theme, this is primarily a kid's game. I understand that. But I just don't think a kid's game needs to be as damn boring as this game was. Honestly, it didn't feel like I was literally doing anything of any importance on any given turn. And, you know, your interaction with your fellow players consisted of nothing more than when you land on one of their spots that somebody else occupies, they get a resource. they get a resource, you get a resource. The person demoing it to us, because we actually demoed it, and for some reason Kim wanted to stay and play the whole damn game, because she hates me, I guess. But we stayed and played the whole damn thing, And the person demoing it suggested that I think when you meet together, you're supposed to high five. So there was a lot of high fiving at the table. That was pretty cool. But, you know, high fiving at the table isn't cool enough to give this game anything more than a D. Next up is the game with what I felt was like one of the coolest themes that I saw this year, Power Vacuum. Power Vacuum is a cute little trick-taking game where you're attempting to accumulate as much power as possible by stealing power from others, doing your best to complete your secret objective without others knowing your goals. Very cool theme involving a bunch of sort of like anthropomorphic appliances fighting for outlets and power after the death of the big boss vacuum cleaner. It was, like I said, it was just pretty cool. For a trick-taking game, which I typically hate, it wasn't too bad. It had some nice twists, you know, rewarding the person playing the lowest card with a few choice abilities to perform. So you didn't always want to win the hand, which was a cool element. Each player has their own goal card too, which is alt-kept secret that typically requires one side to have the least power, while another faction to have the most. And you can change the plugs in between the players to sort of siphon power from one player to another player. So in a trick game, there was some elements of like head games that were occurring at the table, which is something I applaud for a genre that I typically hate. So I'm giving this a C, but I think if you're a big trick-taking fan, I could see you thinking this as an A. And next up is Black Forest. In Black Forest, you expand your domain with new buildings and livestock and travel from village to village to enlist the aid of specialists and collect resources to build the best damn domain possible. The best part about Black Forest is definitely the resource management. It's a really clever wheel that requires a sort of constant balance between resources. Since you remove a resource token from the area closest to the handle of the wheel, it ends up moving the wheel. So it sort of creates this element where like you can gain resources without actually taking actions that gain resources just by the movement of the wheel. It can also, however, be the most frustrating part of the game, where you feel like you have to accumulate resources sometimes you may not want or need just to get the wheel to move to gain what you do want. But this is something you've probably already seen in Glass Road. Glass Road does this as well. The record placement portion of the game, which differentiates itself from Glass Road, is nothing particularly remarkable. You pay a movement cost to sort of travel from village to village. You get to perform the actions in the new village that you go into, and if there's somebody already there that occupies that village, you give them a resource. It's nothing particularly creative, but I didn't really enjoy the worker placement portion, but that resource management thing, I mean, for me, that's kind of what's putting it at the B right now. I did really enjoy it. I really do hope to play this more in the future. Actually, I really hope we can review this because I think Kim really liked it a lot more than I did. And again, I gave it a B, so I think she might even give this an A. And next is Things and Rings. In Things and Rings, players are attempting to guess the shared characteristics between clues like spelling, physical properties, or cultural relevance, and see how they overlap in this big sort of like Venn diagram. The player who gets rid of all their cards is the player who wins. This is a very cute party game that is fairly unique, which I feel is pretty rare in this space. Although I do dislike that it requires a sort of game master to facilitate the experience. I find that's always a position, at least from my experience, that nobody ever wants. The game simply provides a lot of moments for laughter combined with discussion and some, lighthearted disagreement. And when it comes to a party game, that is kind of what you're looking for, I think. I think this was a pretty good party game, and I think if you're in the market for a party game, I think you should check this one out. It was pretty fun. So I'm gonna give this one a B. Next up is Heroes of Might and Magic 3, the board game. In Heroes of Might and Magic 3, players control mighty heroes, vying for control of the land by recruiting new allies, getting resources, and having epic battles that play out on an entirely separate board. I remember seeing all these like hype videos from content creators just all pop up at the exact same time on my feed on YouTube, and just being absolutely psyched for the game. Like everybody just seemed so excited and so enthusiastic, saying it was like the best thing of all time. So I went in here with very high hopes. I had really, really huge expectations for this game, maybe more so than it deserved. Because Heroes is a game that I've mentioned on this channel before, especially if you watch my top 100, that had a very it has a deep emotional resonance for me and my father. So I was pretty psyched to try out the board game. And sadly, this game just didn't feel like it had the same level of depth as the video game. And I understand, like, obviously it can't, the video game is obviously handling a lot of overhead, so it can engage a lot more systems than a board game. But this game didn't seem to have, it just didn't seem to have any depth. You know, the combat system felt way too simple and lacking any real strategy, as the unit abilities felt more, they felt a little cosmetic rather than, you know, strategic differences that I had to utilize in each individual combat. And the game just felt like way too long than what I think it deserved to be, given its complexity and depth. Like, there was a lot of rules for very little payout. And we played this with more than 2, and it was a bloody nightmare. Like, not to mention the setup was the biggest pain in the ass, and honestly, not really worth it for the experience of the game. Many of the cards felt very similar, and the ones that didn't feel similar didn't feel particularly well balanced. But this is coming from somebody who only played it twice, so take that with a grain of salt. And the deck building ability just felt sparse as hell. Like, everything felt like it lacked variety, despite there being so many different versions of the same thing. The game just felt like it was like doomed by the standard Kickstarter issue, where you get loads and loads of expansions all sort of bundled up into a game that doesn't quite fit. You know, it felt like more like content than a damn board game. You know, it was just a big old sandbox of just bullshit. So, you know, I see a lot of people still loving this beyond content creators. So, you know, most of the time I can kind of get why a person likes a game. Even if I don't like it, I would say 95% of the time I understand when a person likes the game and I don't like the game. This one, I don't. I read people's positive reviews and I don't get it. Yeah, let me know in the comment section how wrong I am. I just give this a D. I did not like it. And that about wraps it up for this video, and I guess this year. I think it was a pretty good year all in all. I gave it a lot more A's and S's and B's than I did in past years. I'm pretty pleased. And I'm already gearing up for the next year, hitting up the Discord channels to see if people want to play, you know, the games on Tabletop Simulator or Board Game Arena. Let me know in the comment section if this video was of any help to you, and, you know, if I was totally wrong about this game or I was totally right about this game. Let me know what games you think are the best games of this year. That is all for today. That's all for this year, I guess. So Happy New Year and Merry Christmas, and get out of here. Goodbye. See you in 2025.